Okay, so what I want everyone to do, I'm gonna write a polynomial on the board, and I want everybody to factor it. So x squared minus x minus 6. So write that down. I actually need you to write it down, even if you can do it in your head. Write it down, factor it, right? And then do the little hand raise when you've got it written down and factored. A few of you got it now. All right, so factoring. Not much to this one. When we factor it, we're going to get an x minus 3 and an x plus 2, and you're done, all right? Well, today, and pretty much this is what happens in every math class you ever take. They teach a bunch of ideas, and at some point it all boils down to how do we solve an equation. So my goal is I want to solve this equation. Now, when you solve equations, your job is sometimes it's to get x by itself. I mean, that's how you're sort of taught. But your main goal is find a value that works. So if I give you, think back to what you did in elementary school. Remember how you had the little thing where it says box plus 2 is equal to 5, and you had to figure out what goes in the box? You were solving an equation. You were trying to find what can I put in the box that makes this true. Same thing happens here. I'm trying to find what can I plug in for x to make this true. What can I plug in? Can I plug a 1 in? Well, 1 minus 1 minus 6, does that equal 0? No, so 1 doesn't work. So we could start guessing, right? Unfortunately, we're not in elementary school anymore, and to just guess, to randomly guess what this is going to be, isn't going to work. It might work for simple cases, but it definitely doesn't work when things get complicated. So why is factoring a big deal? Well, the reason factoring is a big deal is if our job is to solve this equation, and we know this factors, it is significantly easier to guess what the answer is when it looks like this as opposed to look like this. And here's why. When you're multiplying to get something to 0, your main goal is, I just want to make sure if I'm going to guess, so I'll go ahead and tell you, I'm going to tell you there are 2 answers. I'll tell you one of the answers, and I'm going to show why it works, and then you'll easily figure out the other one. So it turns out one of the answers is x equals 3, and here's why. If I plug in 3, then 3 minus 3 gives me a 0, 3 plus 2 gives you a 5, 0 times 5, well, I really don't care what this is. When I get 0 times anything, it gives me 0, so I know that 3 works, right? Well, same thing happens. The other one is I think, well, what can give me, so the question you ask is you say, well, what makes this 0? Well, a 3 does. And you ask the same question over here, what makes this 0? So what makes this 0? Well, is an x equals negative 2. So if I get a negative 2, and I plug in, this is going to be, so if I put negative 2 in here, that gives me a 0, and this gives me a negative 5. So I get 0 times negative 5, which gives me a 0. So my 2 answers are 3 and negative 2. All right? So pretty much that's the idea. Before I do the harder problems, let's see what happens. Let's say I give you 2x plus 3 times x minus 4 equals 0. And I kind of want to see where we are. So if I give you this equation, and what I want everyone to do, first write it down, so 2x plus 3 and x minus 4 equals 0. The equals 0 is the important part. And I want everybody to write down your 2 answers, and when you've written down your 2 answers, do the electronic raise your hand. Yeah. There's a really, really common mistake that I see, and so I'm hoping if you made this common mistake, it's okay to make a mistake. I just want you to realize you made the mistake, and let's fix it. So your job is, I want each of these to be 0. So, if I want this to be 0, x minus 4, what makes that 0? X equals 4, not a big deal. But the most common wrong answer I get for this problem, or for this part, is someone will say -3, and your logic is, well, you just take the opposite. You may have heard somewhere, or you that's what you did in Algebra 1, is you took the opposite sign of this and got rid of 4, the opposite sign of this gives you a -3, and so you'd write a -3. Unfortunately, -3 is not correct, because if you plug -3 in here, you're not going to get 0. What I'm going to do, and this is not what you may not need to do this every time, or maybe even the first time, but what's happening? Like when I say what makes this 0, what we're really doing is we're taking this little parentheses and we're saying x minus 4. I'm saying I want that to be 0. Well, since I want this to be 0, when I solve, that gives me x equals 4. That's where the x equals 4 comes from. So if I look here and I want this to be 0, well, it means I want 2x plus 3 is equal to 0. And now when I solve, I end up with x is equal to -3/2. Now, I'm not going to ask for hand raise or whatever, but I'm almost willing to bet that a few of you did not come up with -3/2. I imagine most of you did, and that's great. But I needed to talk about it. All right? So, next up. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, here's what it has to do. What if I give you 12x squared plus 11x minus 15 is equal to 0? And your job is to solve. So, I'm going to press pause. If you don't know how to factor, you're not going to get this one. No, you're not going to get it. I mean, you can't even guess to come up with the right answers. So, let's talk about the factoring part. So, talk about the factoring part. Well, 12, there's lots of ways to get 12. And honestly, I don't know. I'm going to try 3x and 4x. Might not work, but that's where I'm going to start. So I'm going to have 3x and 4x. Next thing I've got to worry about, I got 15. I'm doing something to get to the first term. I need something to get to the last term. 15, again, I'm not sure. I don't think it's going to be 15 and 1 because those numbers get huge. I'm going to try 3 and 5. Well, we have a trick, right? That trick with 3 and 5 is I can't put the 3 here because then there would be something in common. So that means I'll have to put the 3 here and the 5. It's a -15, so one's got to be positive, one's got to be negative. So let's see, I'll make a minus and a plus. Again, no clue, I'm just guessing. All I've done is created something that I know gives me the first term and something gives the last term. And I just have to make sure the middle term works out. So let's see how close I got. Well, when I multiply this together, I get a -20x. This together, I get a 9x. I get a -11x. Oh, that wasn't too bad. All right. -11x, that's the number I wanted, but the wrong sign, so that's easy to fix. Make that a plus, make that a minus, and now I know it works. And if you can do it in your head, great. If not, it's okay. Your job is you want each of these things equal to 0. So if I set 3x plus 5 and set it equal to 0, that's going to give me x is equal to -5/3. And if I put 4x minus 3 is equal to 0, that's going to give me x is equal to 3/4. So there's my two answers. And chances are I couldn't randomly guess these. You had to have this sort of this technique to get your answer. All right, next up. What if it looks like this? So I want everyone to write that down. 3x squared equals 16x plus 12. All right, now, the only way you can ever solve something, right? Solve anytime anytime you have x to an exponent, the only way you can ever solve this is make it look like the previous problems we did, right? If you try to do it any other way, it's not going to happen. So anytime you see x to a power, what we're going to do is I need it equal to 0. Like the only reason those previous problems, we were able to solve those, is that this was equal to 0. So for this particular problem, if I'm going to solve it, I need to make sure it's equal to 0. So that means I'm going to move this stuff over. So I end up with 3x squared minus 16x minus 12 equals 0. All right. Anytime you're solving, when you have a variable, x to any power other than 1, it's like you're not going to get x by itself. You got to set it equal to 0. And basically a phrase I'm going to be saying over and over is set it equal to 0 and hope you can factor. So I've set it equal to 0. Now I'm in the stage of, well, I hope I can factor. Well, first thing I ask, is there anything in common? And there's not, because that 16 really messes stuff up. And then I have to go through and think, well, how do I get a 3x squared? Well, there's not a lot of options. I'm going to have 3x and x. And then I think, well, how on earth do I get a negative 12? And I'm not quite sure on that one. I could do 3 and 4. I'll try 3 and 4. I know the 3 can't go here, so that forces the 3 here, and that forces the 4 here. One's positive, one's negative, and then I check my middle term, and so I end up with, that's 4, that's negative 9. That's not going to give me 16. That doesn't work. Well, since 3 and 4 don't work, what if I do, then, and I couldn't swap those, then I guess I'm going to have to try 6 and 2. And I can't put the 6 here because then there would be a 3 in common, so I'm going to have to put the 6 here and the 2 here. And then when I try, see if I match up my middle term. Let's see, that gives me a 2x, that gives me a negative 18x. Oh look, negative 16x, that's exactly what I needed. I know I factored it correctly. And now that I've got it factored, I'm going to set this equal to 0. And when I set this equal to 0, 3x plus 2, set that equal to 0, it's going to be x equals negative 2 over 3. Set that equal to 0, we just look at that, so x is equal to 6. And so there's our answer. So, key to solving, anytime you see a quadratic, and actually the next chapter when things get a little more complicated, your goal is set it equal to 0 and hope you can factor. Your turn. So what if I give you 2x squared plus 8x equals all right, everybody, write that one down. Solve. 2x squared plus 3x minus 20 is equal to 0. Not a lot of options for 2x. I'm going to have 2x and x. So then you have to think, well, how on earth do you get 20? Well, there's lots of ways, but only one makes a whole lot of sense. First of all, you may already know this, but 2 and 10 can't work because I can't put the 2 here and I can't put the 10 here. So I know 2 and 10 doesn't work. So I'll try 4 and 5. I can't put the 4 here. So I'm going to put the 4 here and the 5 here. Let's see. I have no idea. Let's see. Here, I'll do a plus and a minus because I've got to have change different signs, and then I want to check to make sure my middle term works out. Minus 5x plus 8x, it works. So what makes that 0? X equals -4. What makes that 0? X equals 5/2. All right. Hopefully this is getting easier, right? Or you're remembering from having to do this in Algebra 1. But I got a couple of tricky things that I need to make sure that I talk about. And one of these tricky things looks like this. Now let's say I give you 9x squared minus x is equal to 0. Oh, oops, actually. Equals x. So I need everybody to write down 9x squared equals x. Very, very important. 9x squared equals x. Okay? Everybody's got to have that written. Okay. Write it down on your paper. I don't care if you know the answer. This much space. Write it down. All right. Now, don't write what I'm about to do. Because what I'm about to do is the most common mistake I see. See, what happens is you get this on a quiz or a test or anything, and you look at it and you think, well, I'm going to divide both sides by x. And if you divide both sides by x, that's going to give us 9x is equal to 1, and then you divide, you get x is equal to 1/9, and you write down that as your answer. And unfortunately, while 1/9 works, there's another answer. When you have an equation and you're solving, you can never, ever, ever divide by a variable. If you do that, you're going to miss an answer. So what do? Well, what you do is the exact same thing we've had to do in the previous problems. Anytime you see x squared and an x, you set it equal to 0 and hope you can factor. So how we do this particular problem is I need it to equal 0. Since I need it to equal 0, I'm going to move the x over. So that's going to give me 9x squared minus x equals 0. Now I need to factor. Right? So, well, I've only got two terms, right? I don't have to do that. I don't have to do that parentheses thing. What you do in this case is you ask yourself what's in common, and what's in common in this case is an x. So I'm going to pull an x out. And when I pull the x out, that's going to give me a 9x and a -1. Another mistake that I tend to see is when people look at this, they factor an x out. They're really good about saying, okay, this is going to be 9x, and then they think, well, I took the x away, so this is gone. No. You've got two terms. This has to have two terms. That one's a placeholder. To make sure that you got it right, make sure that when you distribute, this times this gives you 9x squared, this times this gives you an x. You make sure that when you distribute, you get to what you had started with originally. And so now we're left with setting each part equal to 0. All right? Well, if I set this equal to 0, if I set the 9x minus 1 and set that equal to 0, that gives me the x equals 1/9, which is what I had before. But what I didn't have before was I need to set this x equal to 0. And so my two answers are going to be x equals 0 and x equals 1/9. Another way you could think of, remember, your job is find values of x that work. And whenever you're multiplying two things together, you want this to be 0 and get an answer, and you want this thing to be 0 and get an answer. All right, so this is like common mistake, very, very common. You cannot just divide both sides by x. You can divide by numbers, but you can never just divide by a variable. You're going to lose an answer. So, your turn. What if I give you x squared is equal to 3x? So, everybody write. Sorry. Set equal to 0, factor and solve. 0 and 3. All right. Next, not tricky, but I find interesting. So, okay. So I'm going to write an equation on the board, and I want everyone to solve it. Right? and then when you solve it, do the electronic hand raise, and actually, you could probably do this in your head. And I'm going to write down x squared is equal to 16. So I want everyone to write down x squared equals 16, and then I want everybody to solve it. And then after you've got your answer, right, do the electronic hand raise so I kind of have an idea where everybody is. All right. So there's two ways to solve this problem. Okay? And I'm going to solve this problem the way I taught today, but I'm also going to solve this the way that a lot of you may have solved this in the past, and it's also going to give me a chance to explain why you have to do a particular thing. So, the way I said solve this today was, if you see an x squared, set it equal to 0 and factor. So when I set this equal to 0, that's going to give me x squared minus 16 equals 0. I can factor that as x plus 4, x minus 4 equals 0. And then I think, well, what makes that 0? Use a different color, that doesn't show up very well. What makes that 0 is a negative 4. What makes that 0 is a positive 4. All right, everybody unraise your hand, because this is kind of my, so if you've got your hand, the electronic hand raise, unraise them. All right. If you solve this differently, do the electronic hand raise. Okay. So, like, and to be honest, when I was in algebra, I wouldn't solve it this way. I would look at it, and the way I would solve this problem is I'd go over here, and if you gave me x squared is equal to 16, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, right? Because my goal is to get x by itself. I can take the square root of both sides, and then I get x equals, and the square root of 16 is 4. And for some reason, my math teacher kept telling me anytime you take the square root, you need to put plus or minus in front of it. Right? Right? Do you remember that? I mean, you've got, so it's, you know, you have to put the plus or minus. Now, here's why. Notice when you solve this, you got two answers. You got one answer is positive 4, you got one answer is negative 4. This one, if you just take the square root of both sides, it's only going to give you the positive 4. And we need to have both answers, the plus or minus. The other reason, and we'll get to this a little bit later in the chapter, exactly how square roots work. And for square roots to work, they only give the positive answer. But that I find moderately interesting. So, last problem for you guys. I don't have enough time to talk about the test today, so I'll start tomorrow with it. If I give you 5x squared is equal to 45. Everybody solve that. All right. So what do? Well, as I said, you can't divide by variables. I didn't say anything at all about numbers. You can divide, if you have an equation, you can always divide by a number. So the first thing I would do is divide this by 5, so that's going to give me x squared is equal to 9. And kind of doing the problem the way we've done in class is I'm going to say this is x squared minus 9 is equal to 0. So I end up with x plus 3 and then x minus 3. So my answer is negative 3 and 3. And that's it. All right.